Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. I am Judge Renee Cardwell Hughes, and I am the president of the Board of Directors of the Sentencing Project. Thank you for coming out to celebrate the 25th anniversary of the Sentencing Project. We have planned an engaging and thought-provoking program for you this afternoon. We will not only reflect upon from where we have come, but we will also look at where we are today and examine what lies ahead in criminal justice policy. What will the next 25 years hold for us? The state of criminal justice policy is far better today than it was 25 years ago when the Sentencing Project was merely a dream. Each and every one of you in this room has played some role, has in some way contributed to the reforms that have taken place over the last 25 years, and you have absolutely contributed to the intellectual health and heft that surrounds and supports the awareness of the issues that matter to us and the discussions about reform. But today, I take great pride in celebrating the role of the Sentencing Project in the development of where we are today, how we have come to be far more effective, a far more just society. And I know that sounds strange, but if you don't celebrate the small steps, you never get big steps. It is an honor for me to stand here today as president of the board of the organization that I believe to be the premier voice in criminal justice reform. In many ways, I am a beneficiary of the work of the Sentencing Project. You see, I just retired from the bench. For the last 15 and a half years of my career, I was a trial judge. And I began my career doing what the system would call low-level drug felonies, ended my career handling homicides exclusively. During that time, my very first year on the bench, I ruled on 1,100 cases in my first year on the bench. 1,100 principally low-level drug felonies. And I say that word with quotes, low-level drug felonies, because if you're in this room, you know that there is no such thing as a minor criminal conviction. But that's how we characterized them. We characterized them as low-level drug felonies. The program that I began in was designed to encourage people to waive their right to a trial. We could handle these cases in about an hour, quick, fast, and a hurry. And in an hour, you could forfeit significant constitutional guarantees, from voting to jobs to education. And that's what happened in an hour. That, however, is not what was most shocking about my first year on the bench. What was most shocking is that almost 95% of the defendants who stood in front of me were African American. There was a small percentage of Hispanics, Asians were non-existent, and a small percentage of Caucasians. That was stunning. And even more stunning, the vast majority of the defendants had dropped out of school in the 9th grade. Lack of education, unemployment, and addiction were behind the numbers, but because of lack of resources, we were simply locking people up. We were wasting human capital, wasting talent. The cases were all exceptional, because when you scratch the surface of Commonwealth versus, each one was somebody's child. Each one was somebody's grandson, son, loved one, daughter. But there was one that particularly haunts me because I think it was a precursor to the work that we spend a great deal of our time on today, and that was a 16-year-old that I had who was facing a mandatory sentence. He stood at the door of a party, a room probably a third the size of this one, and he just stood at the door while two other older boys who were with him walked through the room and demanded people's jewelry and their wallets and whatever else they had. And if you didn't immediately turn over your stuff, he'd pull up his jacket and you could see the butt of a gun. He never touched the gun, he never pulled it out, he never said a word. He just pulled up his jacket if you didn't turn over your goods. And as a result, the DA sought a mandatory sentence against him. and once the jury convicted him, I was compelled to impose a sentence of 7 to 14 years incarceration. He died inside as a result of undiagnosed asthma. We didn't really do a very good job of evaluating defendants back then. What I learned was a need for a different approach. There had to be a better way to protect our community. There had to be a better way to stop the effects of drugs and the policies that I was subject to. There were so many lives lost. Fortunately for me, I met Mark Maurer and Malcolm Young very, very early in my career. Initially, we worked together to find more effective ways to inform judicial thinking about sentencing. That led to our efforts to reduce racial disparity in every form in the criminal justice system. I spent a lot of time with Mark and Malcolm. I was captivated by the work of the Sentencing Project. And at a time when little old ladies in North Philadelphia and West Philadelphia were the only people talking about the collateral consequences of incarceration, the disparate impact of mandatory drug sentencings on people of color, particularly African Americans, no one was listening. But Mark Maurer and the Sentencing Project were listening. The Sentencing Project gave voice to these little old ladies. The voiceless drove our work for the last 25 years. Our work with juveniles, our opposition to mandatories, the work with the disenfranchised, and the continuing consequences to the poor and people of color from mass incarceration. It has truly, truly been an honor for me to have grown in my career working with the Sentencing Project and Mark. So I thank you for coming out to celebrate what we have done, the changes we have made in this wonderful organization. Now I want you to take a moment and look around this room, because this is a really fabulous room. And I know this looks to you like this was so easy to accomplish, no big deal. I want to tell you that Mark and Terry Nixon, our administrator, and the entire staff and the board have worked for months and months to pull this off and make it look effortless, okay? So I'm glad you don't see the hard work that went into this, but I do so appreciate all that they do to make this organization run smoothly. Today really was designed to both be thought-provoking and fun. Now, you would expect no less from the Sentencing Project. We are going to have a fabulous, fabulous afternoon. We will talk more in depth about the structure of the afternoon later on. I hope you'll take this opportunity today to connect with colleagues and old friends. I hope you'll take this opportunity to meet new friends, because there is much more work ahead of us. And I hope you'll stay for the reception and really get to know new people and, shoulder up to old people. But I want you to spend the next couple of hours being open-minded and being stimulated and reinvigorated. Reinvigorated because the work is not done. There is much to do. The cause that led to the founding of the Sentencing Project, the cause that continues to inform our work today, simply stated, a fair and effective criminal justice system. That work is not done. There is much more ahead of us. It is ironic that in these times of economic difficulty, sentencing reform is actually good business. It's actually cheaper. But we'll talk about that later. We have lots of ideas to talk about. What we want to do right now is jump straight into our program. Mark is going to take the podium and give you a brief retrospective of how fast 25 years have gone by and the changes that have occurred, and then introduce you to our fabulous keynote speaker, Jeremy Travis. Mark?
Well, thank you so much, Renee. And as you can see, a lot of our success has to do with our leadership here and stuff, as well as the other members of our board, who you'll meet later. I also want to extend my great appreciation to all of you for being here to join with us in both this celebration and discussion about these important issues. Many of you in the room, people have been with us for a long time in very different kinds of ways, and we're really delighted to have you here for this 25th anniversary. I'm a relative newcomer to the organization. I've only been here for 24 years, actually, but I've read up about the history in the first year, so I think I'm pretty much up to date about what's going on here. We're here today for two reasons. One is, yes, to celebrate our accomplishments over 25 years. And I would like to think that we have made a contribution to the public dialogue and public policy about crime and justice over that period of time. I think in the research and the advocacy work that we've done, the issues that we've tried to highlight regarding mass incarceration, the war on drugs, racial ethnic disparities in the criminal justice, juvenile justice system, the broad-ranging collateral consequences, I would like to think we've helped to open up a different discussion about those issues, and in some cases helped to change policy and practice along with the efforts of many of our colleagues around the country. So we want to celebrate those accomplishments, but probably more importantly, we want to look ahead, and we want to use this as an opportunity to look 25 years into the future and basically say what kind of criminal justice system, what kind of public safety policy would we want to see at that point. So in order to lay the framework for what that examination should look like, let's just take a quick look at where we, the field of criminal justice, have come in the last 25 years. And it seems to me there are two different stories we could tell about that 25-year period. The first story is one that's fairly grim and one that looks at the trends that were beginning to take place 25 years ago and looks at how they've deepened and become virtually institutionalized in many ways. And the framework of that story looks like this. First of all, the number of people incarcerated in our prisons and jails has nearly tripled from about 800,000 in 1986 to 2.3 million today. The racial disparities in incarceration are extreme. An African-American male in his early 30s has a 1 in 9 chance of being behind bars as we speak. Prisons and jails hold a record number of drug offenders, a figure that's risen from about 100,000 in 1986 to 500,000 today. Our sentencing policies are extremely harsh by any world standards. One of every 11 people in prison today is serving a life sentence, and that includes 2,500 serving life without parole for crimes committed as a juvenile. Incarceration of women is similarly at record rates, more than 200,000 women behind bars. And the developing collateral consequences of conviction, in many ways now even more restrictive because of policy actions taken in recent years, now affect a very broad range of access to benefits and services, not the least of which is in the elections coming up next year, 5 million Americans will not be able to participate in that voting, not because they don't care, but because their felony conviction status makes them ineligible. So overall, the United States now leads the industrialized world by far in its use of imprisonment, the death penalty, juvenile serving life without parole, felony disenfranchisement, and many other categories. And this is not a record to be proud of, particularly for a nation that prides itself on its democratic traditions. So that's one story that could be told, and unfortunately, I think it's a very accurate story. But there's another story that can be told, and it's one that I think should give us reason for some hope, some cautious optimism that we can do things differently. And that story looks like this. First of all, crime rates have been declining for the last 15 years or so. There's still an ongoing debate about why they're declining, but nonetheless they are, and it's a very welcome development. The Alternatives to Incarceration movement, which was very scattered back in 1986, is now very much a part of every courtroom in America. The reentry movement, which really was launched only a little over a decade ago, has really captured the imagination of policymakers and practitioners alike across the country. Similarly, the concept of justice reinvestment is also getting a great deal of attention and experimentation with doing things differently in criminal justice. And if we look at the prison system, prison populations are finally beginning to stabilize, it seems, and in some states beginning to decline even substantially in a number of states in recent years. And legislators, both the federal and state levels, are beginning to reconsider the wisdom of mandatory sentencing and excessive sentencing, broadly speaking. So that story is one of hope, one of optimism that we can do things better. And so we're now at a point where we have the paradox of what seems to be a criminal justice system that's far more sophisticated and creative than it was 25 years ago, coexisting with a world record commitment to punishment. And there's something wrong with that picture. We have to make some choices. It seems to me the last 25 years we've been engaged in an experiment of mass incarceration as a means of crime control. I think for the next 25 years we need a different kind of experiment, one that aims to produce safe communities, not by punishment, but by creating opportunity for all. It's a simple thing to say, it's a complicated thing to put in place, but it seems to me that needs to be our agenda from here on out. How do we create a different system that works much better for everyone? So let me give you an overview of what we're going to do today to try to begin the discussion about those questions. First, we're going to see a short video, which is having its world premiere. You are the first audience that will ever see this, and you can tell your friends about that. It's called Unlocking Justice, which tries to lay out some of these issues. I will then introduce our keynote speaker, Jeremy Travis. Following his talk, we'll have a short break, and then an interactive panel discussion featuring some distinguished thinkers on these issues led by Professor Angela Davis. Following the forum, we will have a reception just next door, which will feature remarks by Congressman Bobby Scott, by Lori Robinson, Assistant Attorney General, and Malcolm Young, founder of the Sentencing Project. And one more note, too, we very much see this discussion today as the beginning of a conversation. One of the many products we hope will grow out of this is that we are putting together a publication that features different perspectives on what this 25-year vision will look like. So we'll be putting that out in the new year. It will include the text of our keynote speech today. We've also invited 25 leading scholars and policy advocates and thinkers to give us their vision of what the criminal justice system should look like in 25 years. And we'll be putting that together as a complete publication. We'll keep you posted about that. So thank you so much, all of you, for being here. We look forward to a very stimulating day. And I think we're going to start off by going to the movies. Okay? Thank you. Well, so one vision of how we can do things better. There's a lot we could say about that. One thing that strikes me is if you look at the Red Hook cases, one of them, Lamont Williams, if you listen to his criminal record as he described it, imagine he had been living in the state of California instead of New York. He would have been a prime candidate for a 3 strikes and you're out sentence, and he would currently be doing 25 to life in a California prison. Instead, we see what else we could be doing in situations like this. So we can do things much better in our day-to-day practice. Let me just note we have a few movie stars in the room with us today. I just want to call attention to them. So please stand if you can. First, from Brooklyn, Joe Hines, and their staff from Red Hook here as well. Okay. Thank you. Thank you so much. Ellen Clark from North Carolina. There's Ellen. Ellen Ellen's had a career devoted to alternative sentencing programs like this, and we appreciate it. And from Harrisburg's, the staff of the MST program, I think several of you are here. Please stand. Thank you so much. Also, you probably think I made this production myself, but I did not actually. And we had a wonderful team working with us from New Media Mill Productions, Stu Harris, Gabrielle Weiss, and video manager Rashid Willis in the back, all three of them. Please give them a round of applause. Thank you so much. Well, now it's my great honor and pleasure to introduce my good friend and colleague, Jeremy Travis, as our keynote speaker. Jeremy is well known to many of you in the room. He's had a distinguished career as a practitioner, as a scholar, and a leading thinker on how we can produce better public policy. Jeremy Travis is the president of John Jay College of Criminal Justice in New York. His career in criminal justice began in New York in various positions with the Legal Aid Society, the Vera Institute of Justice, and then as deputy commissioner for legal affairs with the New York Police Department. Most of you know him probably better from his years here in Washington as director of the National Institute of Justice in the 1990s, and following that as a senior fellow at the Urban Institute. Jeremy is often considered, I think, as the sort of grandfather of the reentry movement. He's a very youthful-looking grandfather. But as you know, the reentry movement has really transformed the criminal justice system remarkably. And, you know, as social change goes, these things aren't supposed to happen in 10 or 12 years. And so we don't want to lose sight of the fact that what a significant transformation that has been. Jeremy is here because I think he's one of the most thoughtful people in our field. He's had a career devoted to asking fundamental questions about what effective approaches to public safety should look like. And I think what's most important for me is the process by which he goes about trying to answer those questions. The first part of his approach involves engaging with practitioners in the field, listening carefully to them, and learning from their experiences and incorporating that into our thinking. He's a strong believer in examining the research in the field and learning from what we can find out is going on and asking additional sets of questions to help refine our understanding about these problems and these possible solutions. And perhaps most importantly, he does all this by taking a compassionate approach to public policy that recognizes humanity of all involved in trying to resolve these problems. And it seems to me that's a model that we should also strive to follow. So please welcome me in joining Jeremy Travis.
So good afternoon. Good afternoon. So let me first just thank Mark for that very generous introduction. Thoughtful. It's always fun to be called a grandfather. Someday that'll be true. But I do want to say how much I've appreciated my interactions with Mark Maurer over the years that we've known each other, and with, in particular, with the Sentencing Project. And thanks to Judge Hughes for bringing the Sentencing Project in a leadership way to the place where it is today. We all know who work in the nonprofit arena or in government that the chairs of our board of directors are very important people in our lives, and we count on them for guidance and for inspiration, and that's clear. That's been offered by the judge. I also just want to say there's many friends in the room, and I hope to spend time talking to many of you during the break. And some of you, I'm going to take the liberty of talking about your work in this speech I'm about to give. And if I leave you out, no offense, but it's good to be here among friends. So I'm really honored, beyond words, to have been asked to deliver this particular keynote speech, celebrating the 25th anniversary of the Sentencing Project. So as is evident, I think, from the film that we saw and from the words spoken already from the podium, the Sentencing Project has been, in my estimation, and I believe yours as well, a beacon of light, shining through what are some very dark clouds in our nation's debates over crime policy. And under the inspired leadership of Mark Maurer and Malcolm Young before him, the Sentencing Project, in my view, has been able to achieve what few other organizations in the criminal justice policy world have achieved, namely the ability to strike the right balance between hard-nosed, objective, and trustworthy research on the one hand, and principled, logical, and strategic advocacy on the other. Not many organizations, in fact, few, can do that. And today, we can only marvel at the outsized impact of this feisty, small budget, I said that for you so you can raise more money, small budget organization, and just consider 3 examples from a very large portfolio. In large part, because of the Sentencing Project's work, our country has now reduced the racial disparities in sentencing for offenses involving crack cocaine, has begun to roll back our felon disenfranchisement statutes, and has reversed many of the mandatory minimum sentencing schemes that needlessly put thousands of people in prison. So this is an impressive track record. So I think today, as we gather to celebrate their 25th anniversary, we should be grateful for the work of the Sentencing Project, wish them many more years of success, and realize that in very real ways, the Sentencing Project is helping us to reclaim our position as a nation devoted to justice. So I've been given a challenging assignment today, one I've never had before. While we sit here and reflect on the past quarter century, Mark has asked me to focus on the next quarter century to start a conversation, to envision the world of criminal justice policy in 2036. So in taking on this assignment, one is tempted to paint a future world of peace and harmony, where lions and lambs lie together, where our elected officials are all wise and enlightened, and debates over crime policy are resolved rationally by referring to agreed upon principles, shared values, and scientific evidence. But I doubt this ideal world will exist in 2036. But I still think we can set some very lofty goals for ourselves. So let's agree upon the following: that in the next quarter century, we should aspire to create a crime policy that is both more effective and more humane. Now, by more effective, I mean we should respond to crime in ways that produce socially desirable results. Greater safety, less fear, less suffering, greater respect for the rule of law, and less injustice. And that we do that efficiently, investing our precious financial and human resources in ways that maximize the results we desire. That's what I mean by more effective. By more humane, I mean we should respond to crime in ways that recognize the humanity of those victimized by crime, those arrested and convicted of crime, and others who experience the ripple effects of crime and of our justice system. This affirmation of humanity, as I see it, incorporates values we hold dear in our democracy, such as equal protection of the laws, access to the rights guaranteed by our Constitution, and our fundamental belief in the dignity of the individual. So I need not detail for this audience the many ways that our current reality falls short of these goals. Too many victims have difficulty getting their lives back on track. Too often, our police use excessive force, fail to follow legal dictates, and undermine the respect for the rule of law. Our system of adjudication too often coerces defendants to act against their interests and excludes victims from meaningful engagement. Our jails and prisons are frequently full beyond capacity and too often resemble human warehouses rather than humane places for reflection, rehabilitation, and restoration. Our response to crime is marked by racial disparities that belie our commitment to equal protection of the laws. And we have become a society with a growing population of individuals with felony records, with a prison experience, a population that we marginalize through legal barriers and social stigma. So, if we want our response to crime to be more effective and more humane than this, Here's what we have to do. We must summon the assistance of two powerful superheroes. Two forces that, working together, can sweep away the cobwebs of our minds, clear the highest organizational hurdles, and move political mountains. What, you might ask, are these two superheroes? The superheroes are science, the quest for empirical truth and organized knowledge, and passion, the human impulse to seek justice. Now, people sometimes think that science and passion are opposite human endeavors, that they are mutually exclusive. But in my view, these superheroes are not rivals. In fact, the power of each is enhanced by the power of the other. To advance the cause of justice by 2036, we must be passionate about the importance of science. And we must incorporate the lessons of science into our passionate advocacy for a more effective and humane response to crime. In short, we must all learn the lessons of the Sentencing Project. So let's think about the challenges that we face and see how science and passion can work together. So I would like to nominate this afternoon for your consideration the following 5, we'll call them great challenges, for the next quarter century. As you will soon see, these are challenges that extend far beyond sentencing practice. The first challenge, the first of the 5 great challenges. We must help crime victims rebuild their lives. So when a crime is committed, the social contract is broken. Our typical response to that event is to focus our resources and energy primarily on finding the offender, prosecuting the offender, and providing an appropriate criminal sanction if he is convicted. So let's ask ourselves, why do we overlook the legitimate needs of the victim? Why does our passion for justice not extend fully to those harmed by crime? And let's begin by asking, what would science tell us about the experiences, needs, and the life course of crime victims? So let's look at the scientific record. One of the most important criminological discoveries of the past 2 decades is the phenomenon of repeat victimization. The research finding that for some crimes, once somebody is victimized, there's a high probability that that same individual will soon be victimized again. In fact, the risk of re-victimization is highest in the period immediately following the first incident. So in my view, this scientific finding, which applies to victims of burglary, victims of sexual assault, victims of domestic violence, among other categories of crimes, this scientific finding should create a social obligation to intervene to prevent the next crime. Secondly, science also tells us that for many crime victims, the crime itself causes long-term negative effects. Victims are more likely to experience mental illness, suicide, and substance abuse than the general population. Victims of violent crime suffer elevated levels of post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, and suffer many of the PTSD symptoms, such as becoming fearful and withdrawn, and experiencing difficulties in professional, social, and intimate relationships. So given these social harms, why do we not intervene to help mitigate the damage caused by crime? Third, research also tells us that child abuse and neglect frequently creates an intergenerational cycle of violence, to use a phrase coined by Kathy Spatz-Whittam. Children who suffer in this way are more likely than a comparable peer group to engage in delinquent and criminal acts when they grow up. Given this fact, given this research, how can we not provide special interventions for these, our most vulnerable, to help them secure a brighter future, while simultaneously also preventing future crimes? Now, finally, we also know that, and have known for decades, that most victims never see their cases go to court because most crimes do not result in an arrest. And in a small percentage of those cases where there is an arrest, about 20%, A high percentage of those cases are resolved through plea bargains or result in dismissals, so victims play a minor role, if any, in those proceedings. And finally, even in the very small percentage of cases that go to trial, where the crime victim may be a more active participant, the victim's immediate and long-term needs are rarely addressed. And given this statistical reality, why have we focused so much attention over the past 25 years on the role of victims in criminal proceedings at the expense of devising a societal response to all victims, whether or not the offender is ever arrested or prosecuted? Where is our passion? Where is our concern for human suffering? Where is our sense of justice? Now, some of you in the room may know that I have to hasten to add that my thinking on this topic has been influenced by the work of my wife, Susan Herman. In order for me to go home tonight, I have to say this quickly. Susan, as you may know, has developed a concept called parallel justice. Now, according to the principles of parallel justice, we should not conceptualize our response to crime victims simply as an act of charity, which is what we do when we think about compensation, nor merely through the creation of rights in criminal proceedings, which is what a lot of the statutory movement has done. Rather, in her view, the concept of parallel justice requires that we respond to victims more effectively and more humanely because the pursuit of justice requires it. So if the science is clear, a more effective response to victims will repeat victimization of future offending and will prevent long-lasting social harms and repair the social fabric. And I would suggest we could hypothesize, although the research has not yet been done, that a more humane response to crime victims would enhance their respect for the rule of law and would reduce the overall retributive mood in our country. Then we need to ask ourselves, why have we not taken the needs of crime victims more seriously? Now, unfortunately, we have created a two-track world that sees the interests of victims and offenders as oppositional, that counts individuals like those of us in this room as either victim advocates or justice reform advocates, that pits the suffering of prisoners against the suffering of victims. And I think we are a better nation than this history would suggest. So I would hope that between today and 2036, we expand our concept of justice to embrace a societal obligation to those harmed by crime. Our passion for justice, working in tandem with strong science, will lead the way. Second, great challenge. I believe we must pursue a focused and scientific crime prevention agenda. Now, as Mark alluded to, we are fortunate to be meeting at a time when crime rates in America are at historic lows. People in this room know that there are two distinct narratives about crime trends in America. The better-known narrative is the story of violent crime. After a decline in the early 1980s, rates of violence in America spiked upwards, starting in the mid-80s with the introduction of crack cocaine in America's cities. Then, as the crack epidemic subsided and the attendant violence started to subside, violent crime rates started a historic decline, dropping to rates lower than those seen in the 1960s, with yet another 12% decline from 2009 to 2010, reported last month by the FBI. Less well known is the narrative of property crime. Property crime has been in steady decline since the early 1970s. Our rates of property crime today are half their level when that decline started. So both categories of crime, violent crime and property crime, are at historic low levels and reached that result through very different trends. And who amongst us, particularly those who've worked in the field for the past 25 years, would have thought that we could stand here in the nation's capital and make that statement, that crime is at historic lows? Before we get too satisfied with that result, I want to draw three lessons from this story. First, the social scientist in me must say that we need a much better understanding of why this happened. I can think of no stronger indictment of our field than this. We do not have a satisfactory, much less a sophisticated understanding of the reasons that crime has increased and decreased so dramatically over the last 25 years. So let's imagine that we were meeting at the press club at a medical convention, noting that the incidence of one type of cancer had dropped in half since 1970, and that another type of cancer had devastated America's inner cities, particularly its communities of color, and then dropped precipitously. Would we not expect that the medical research community would have developed a deep understanding of what happened, what treatments worked, what environmental factors influenced those results, what strains of these cancers have proved particularly resistant? So the scientists among us really need to get to work with appropriate funding from foundations and the federal government to help us understand our own history of crime trends. And looking forward, we need to develop a much more sophisticated data infrastructure to allow us to track crime trends in close to real time. Next time you watch the evening news and somebody's reporting on what's happening in our economy, make this comparison. If economists can tell us which sectors of the economy were growing or declining last month, certainly we can build a data infrastructure to help us understand crime trends last year. So here's a second lesson from the story of low crime rates. I believe we need to rethink what we mean by crime prevention. Too often we narrowly define crime prevention only in terms of programmatic investments in young people to help them lead more productive, pro-social lives. But clearly, over the past 40 years, the historic decline in crime rates has not come about because we simply invested massively in crime in our young people to avoid criminal activity. Other policy choices have also made a difference, and perhaps the controlling difference. Let me just give one example to provoke some thought. According to a really provocative new book by Frank Zimring on the crime decline in New York City, that city's, my city's, auto theft rate in 2008 is 6%. 6% of what it was in 1990. But how were those crimes all prevented? How much can be attributed to changes in safety practices and theft prevention technologies developed by the auto industry, or by new federal regulations requiring the marking of auto parts to deter the operation of chop shops, or by more effective police investigations? While you're thinking about those questions, I just want to make a simple point, which is that a rigorous scientific exploration of changes in crime rates will isolate a broad set of practices and policies that prevent crime, assign costs and benefits to those practices, and hopefully help us invest money and political capital in those crime prevention strategies that reduce harm. If we are passionate, as we must be, about reducing our crime rates even further by 2036, we will broaden our frame of reference and bring many more sectors of our society to the crime prevention table. Finally, there's a third, and I would submit, uncomfortable lesson that the great American crime decline should teach us. We have no reason to be complacent and every reason to be very upset. The rates of lethal violence in America are still higher by a factor of 5 or so than those in Europe. I note that our rates of property crime are, by contrast, lower than those in Europe. But I want to focus on violence. And if we are ruthless about our science, we must confront the reality that violent crime is highly concentrated in a small number of communities of color in urban America, and in those communities is further concentrated among a small number of young men. These men are at high risk of being both victims of violence and agents of violence. So let me cite some data to make the point. A few years ago, a colleague of mine, John Clofus, who's a professor at the Rochester Institute of Technology, examined that city's homicide data to determine who was at the highest risk of being killed and what was their rate at which they faced the possibility of being murdered. So at the time of his research, a couple of years ago, the homicide rate for the nation as a whole was 8 per 100,000. It's a little lower right now. That says something, but really nothing valuable, in my view. So we want to start to disaggregate those data. Among those aged 15 to 19, the homicide rate is triple that. Okay? Young people, that's where crime occurs. It was 22 per 100,000. Among males in those group, we have a big gender difference in offending rate. It was more than quadruple the national rate, about 36 per 100,000. Now let's get to Rochester and look at the population of concern. For African American males aged 15 to 19 in Rochester, it was 264 per 100,000. Then we want to focus geographically. In Rochester, there's a neighborhood called the High Crime Crescent, which, as its name implies, has the highest crime rates in that city. In that part of Rochester, the homicide rate was 520 per 100,000, or 65 times the national rate. More recently, another colleague, Andrew Papachristos of the University of Massachusetts at Amherst, took this approach of disaggregating the homicide rate one step further. Using a database of all young men involved in criminally active groups in a neighborhood in Chicago. So we've got young men involved in criminally active groups in one neighborhood in Chicago. Dr. Papachristos calculated that the homicide rate within those groups was 3,000 per 100,000, compared to a national rate of 8, 7 or so per 100,000. That's 375 times the national rate. Note that this group is also the group that is responsible for a significant portion of the violence in that neighborhood. So, in my view, this rate of murder constitutes a national crisis. Yet we turned a blind eye to this reality, lulled into inaction by our self-congratulatory sense of progress about crime rates coming down, and, frankly, our collective unwillingness to tackle the issue of violence in inner-city communities of color, a topic I will return to. So, to reduce the rates of violence in America over the next quarter century, we must tackle this phenomenon head-on with great care and with great persistence. As some of you are not surprised to know, I'm a strong proponent of the focused deterrence strategies developed by David Kennedy, a professor at John Jay College of Criminal Justice. These strategies, first tested in Boston 15 years ago, expanded to drug market work in High Point, North Carolina, more recently, and now being implemented in 70 cities across the country through the National Network of Safe Communities, which is housed at John Jay. These strategies have proven highly effective at reducing group violence, typically by 40 to 50%, and virtually eliminating overt open-air drug markets. These strategies have two other benefits. They reduce incarceration rates, and they promote a process of racial reconciliation between police and communities of color. We don't want to do something along the lines of what I suggest, which is to focus laser-like on the issue of violence in inner-city neighborhoods and among this age group, if we are at the same time increasing rates of incarceration and promoting tension between police and communities. So if we are serious about creating communities that are safer and more just, I believe we must insist that these strategies be replicated nationwide. So a scientifically based crime prevention agenda will expand our vision to incorporate the many ways that crime can be prevented, while focusing laser-like on neighborhoods and individuals at the highest risk of most extreme violence to save them from harm and to save them from prison. Now, on this latter point, strong science can direct us, but I believe that passionate advocacy is really necessary to win the day. Unfortunately, American society is not sympathetic to the argument that because young African American men, many of them involved in crime themselves, are at the greatest risk of all of us of being killed, that we therefore should devote our greatest resources to preventing those crimes. So to advance that agenda, we have to overcome some high hurdles, and our superheroes have got to be great. We have to overcome barriers of racism, fear, and stereotyping. But if our crime policy is to be more effective and more humane, we have to bring all of our tools, science and passion, to the task. Third big challenge. You still with me? Ready for two more? Third, we must use science to develop professional standards for the justice system. So this is a different take on some of these issues, very much on my mind these days. So one of the more important developments in social policy generally and in crime policy specifically has been the embrace of the notion of evidence-based practices. We hear it all the time, right? We have to have evidence-based practices. So the Office of Management and Budget has adopted this mantra with great gusto. The Office of Justice Programs in the Justice Department has joined the chorus. George Mason University even hosts a center called the Center on Evidence-Based Crime Policy. Now, with some reservations that I won't discuss here, I applaud this movement. And rather than discuss those reservations, I would like to challenge us to imagine the world of 2036, when we hopefully will have much more evidence about what works and what doesn't. In 2036, when that day arrives, we have to ask ourselves this question: how will we enforce the science of effectiveness? How will we ensure that practice follows research and criminal justice agencies are held to evidence-based standards? So, just to get one thing off the table, in imagining this new world, I recognize we are immediately confronted with the realities of our federal system, in which the states, not the federal government, are primarily responsible for criminal justice operations. Granted, we have some national standards of practice, some imposed by federal courts through constitutional interpretation, think Miranda. We have other standards imposed by federal oversight or regulatory agencies, think of the FBI's reporting guidelines for the UCR. Yet as a general matter, as a nation, we shy away from federally imposed or nationally imposed standards of practice. But must it always be so? Is it possible for us to imagine a national framework in which certain standards of practice, validated by strong science, have equal force and effect all across the country? So stick with me while I tell a recent story. This dilemma was highlighted for me recently by a court ruling in New Jersey called the State versus Henderson Case, and by a research report published by the American Judicature Society. Both examine the same issue, the unreliability of eyewitness memory. As we know from hundreds of exonerations based on DNA evidence, errors attributable to faulty eyewitness memory can result in serious miscarriages of justice. Hundreds, perhaps thousands, of individuals have spent years in America's prisons for crimes they did not commit. A small number have even been put to death. But we also now know from strong scientific studies that eyewitness evidence can be gathered in a way that reduces the likelihood of error without compromising our ability to identify the true suspect. This method, called sequential double-blind, to use some jargon, meaning that a witness sees possible suspects either in lineups or in photo arrays, one after another rather than all at once, and that the procedure is administered blind, meaning administered by someone with no connection to the investigation. The power of this method is that we can reduce error, and the power of this method was recently conclusively demonstrated in this multi-site field experiment with random assignment conducted by AJS. So now we face this question, and here's the mind experiment. How do we as a nation ensure that all investigations involving eyewitness evidence are conducted according to this proven procedure? The New Jersey Supreme Court has now established standards for that state with commendable reference to the strong scientific basis for those standards. There's a case coming up before the United States Supreme Court, and maybe they'll issue a similar Miranda-like ruling, although let's not count on that outcome. But setting that aside, in the meantime, what should be the rule in states other than New Jersey? In those states, how long will we allow defendants to be convicted and sentenced to prison terms based on faulty methods as our sacrifice on the altar of federalism? So in less dramatic terms, we have faced this dilemma before. To cite well-known examples, we continue to fund DARE, Scared Straight programs, and batterers intervention programs long after the research has shown they're ineffective. On a broader scale, we fund programs of unknown effectiveness that have never been rigorously tested. And even when we have competent evaluations in hand, we care little about the effect size. In other words, does the program make a big or a small difference? We care even less about cost-benefit analysis. Did the program effects more than offset the cost of the program? So in making the case for, in essence, a crime science, I turn again to the medical model for an analogy. So let's imagine that medical research has found an effective treatment for migraines. Who's a migraine sufferer, right? Okay. Wouldn't it be great if there was an effective treatment for migraines? So you would probably be shocked if you were a Washington patient going into your doctor's office, knowing this treatment exists, to be told that it's available in New Jersey, but we have to validate it here in Washington, D.C. first. And you know, that takes a few years. Let's imagine if this Washington doctor said something that we hear all too often in the criminal justice world. Well, migraines in Washington are just different from those migraines in New Jersey. So anything they learn in New Jersey, it's not going to work here. We are so far from crime science. So we probably cannot alter, nor would I want to, our federal structure of government, but I believe we can develop a robust concept of justice professionalism, in which policies and practices of proven effectiveness are adopted by police, prosecutors, judges, corrections, service, and treatment providers. We need a professional ethic that views failure to adopt those proven policies and practices as a form of judicial malpractice. Thank you. As our science becomes stronger and our evidence base becomes deeper, which it will over the next 25 years, we need to be passionate about demanding that the agencies of justice follow the clear implications of that science. Fourth big challenge. We're getting closer to sentencing. I know this is about the sentencing project. We're almost there. Fourth, we have to rethink the role of the criminal sanction. One of the great advances in our profession came nearly a half-century ago when the President's Commission on Law Enforcement and the Administration of Justice specified for the first time the complex interactions of the agencies that comprise the, quote, criminal justice system. This system is now depicted in the famous chart. We've all seen it in our criminal justice textbooks with, the crime, the funnel, the crime on one side, they don't all get reported, they don't all get arrested. Then there are the agencies of justice in the middle, prosecutors, police, prosecutors, and corrections, and prisons. And everyone knows this funnel, right? Famous, right? This portrayal of the criminal justice system may have clarified some of the working relationships of those agencies, but I would submit that it created a new problem, a problem we still live with. The case that moves through that funnel has become our unit of analysis. You were talking about before how many cases you handled, right? And you started then talking about people and what was going on with them. So we focus attention on the cases that move down the assembly line of the justice system, from the outbox of one agency to the inbox of the next agency. It's an assembly line. Now, over the past 20 years, thanks to people in this room, Another metaphor has emerged, one that stands in stark contrast to the image of the assembly line. In this metaphor, which we saw beautifully in Red Hook, the agencies of the justice system are organized around a problem, not a case. Rather than the assembly line, this approach envisions a collaborative table at which the assets of various agencies are deployed to address an underlying problem, not just to determine the outcome of a criminal prosecution. This new approach was first championed by the police, inspired by a pioneering article and book by Herman Goldstein on problem-oriented policing. Professor Goldstein made this heretical assertion that the unit of analysis for effective policing was a problem, a community problem, not a 911 call. This powerful insight led directly to the concept of hotspots policing, which focuses police resources on addressing crime problems that are spatially concentrated. In a broader sense, the problem-centered approach to crime lies at the heart of community policing, with its emphasis on community partnerships to address community problems. This problem-oriented focus also led to the creation of the first drug courts in Miami by our former Attorney General, Janet Reno, the first community court in Manhattan in 1993, and a generation of innovative problem-solving courts like the Red Hook Community Justice Center that are addressing issues such as mental health, domestic violence, and drunk driving. This new way of thinking also informs the work of Professor Kennedy, whose groundbreaking strategies were designed to address the problems of youth violence and overt drug markets, not just make arrests for criminal law violations. It undergirds the premise of Project Hope, and the work of Professor Mark Kleiman of UCLA. Project Hope is a highly successful project that was first launched in Hawaii, designed to reduce drug use and crime among the community corrections population. It lies at the heart of the restorative justice movement, which convenes victims, offenders, and other stakeholders to address harms and repair relationships. And finally, this pragmatic approach to problems, not cases, provides the framework for the reentry movement that Mark alluded to, which brings new partners to the table to address the challenges faced by individuals leaving prison. In this new way of thinking, in this new world, everyone's role is changing. In the focused deterrence work, probation officers are part of a strategy with police, prosecutors, and community members in which their supervisory authority is used to achieve certain behavioral outcomes for probationers. In drug courts and community courts, prosecutors and defense attorneys collaborate with judges to impose sometimes minor criminal penalties on participants who might violate their criminal terms, their treatment terms. In Project Hope, drug tests are used explicitly to prevent drug use and cut recidivism, but only secondarily to detect levels of drug use. These initiatives challenge our received wisdom. They envision a very different system, one that is more collaborative than adversarial. But they are even more revolutionary than that. At their core, they envision a very different role for the criminal sanction and the relationship between the criminal sanction and individual behavior. If, as in the case of drug courts, the behavior of drug addicts changes because of the mere possibility of the imposition of a criminal sanction, why would we not defer the imposition of the criminal sanction and maybe even the prosecution itself more frequently? If, in the case of the focused deterrence model, gang members and drug dealers no longer engage in violence or drug dealing because of some combination, almost magical combination of peer pressure, community influence, the voices of their mothers, and a credible threat from the law enforcement partners that they will be arrested if the violence and drug dealing continues, then why would we not package the criminal sanction in that way more frequently if we're concerned about effectiveness and a more humane system? So when I step back from that recent history, I come to the conclusion that we are on the verge of a fundamental conceptual breakthrough that will rival what the President's Commission came up with 50 years ago. These problem-oriented innovations are showing us that if we apply the criminal sanction in a very parsimonious way including not at all, in combination with other interventions, we can reap enormous benefits in crime reduction and in the enhanced legitimacy of the justice system. These innovations, in turn, require us to reconsider our approach to sentencing, to become less punitive and less rigid. And finally, these problem-solving approaches show us how to engage more effectively with the forces of informal social control, such as family, positive peer pressure, and community and service supports, so we can rely less on the forces of formal social control, such as arrest, prosecution, and imprisonment. In the future, if our science continues to support the effectiveness of these interventions, and we are passionate about applying those lessons, the criminal justice system, as a mechanical assembly line, may be a relic of our past. Final big challenge. One second. Fifth, we must rethink a venerable American institution, the prison. Now, anyone who follows the work of the Sentencing Project knows the sobering facts. The rate of incarceration in America has nearly quadrupled since 1980. America holds 1/4 of the world's prisoners, even though we constitute only 5% of the world's population. An African-American man faces a 1 in 3 lifetime chance of spending at least a year in prison. In 1972, there were 200,000 people in our nation's prisons, and this year we have that number serving life sentences. In California, where everything happens in Technicolor, 20% of the prison population, according to a recent study by Stanford Law School, is serving a life sentence. 20%. In 2007, we spent $44 billion on corrections, up from $10.6 billion in 1987. The number of people incarcerated in state prisons on drug offenses has increased at least by 550% over the past 20 years. And this year, approximately 735,000 individuals will leave state and federal prison, compared to fewer than 200,000 in 1980. Now, just to be clear, we must acknowledge, as Mark did, that the era of prison growth in America may have ended. We have some good news. The last 3 years, the prison population has stabilized, if not declined. In some states, prison populations have actually declined substantially, led by California, Michigan, and New York, which have seen declines of 4,000, 3,000, and 1,500 respectively between 2008 and 2009. And in the juvenile justice system, a story that needs to be told more, we've seen substantial declines in juvenile detention and placement levels. But I would suggest that these decreases should not be a cause for celebration. We have a long way to go to bring our incarceration rate into line with other Western democracies, or even with our own history. So, as Americans, I think we should be deeply troubled by the current state of affairs. In fact, I think we should consider our current level of imprisonment a stain on our national conscience. We can certainly criticize our high rate of incarceration on any number of policy grounds. Prisons are a very ineffective response to crime, very expensive. As a crime control strategy, it's highly inefficient, requiring lots of resources with little benefit. Not no benefit, but little benefit in terms of crime control. Prisons have become part of our national landscape, literally scattered across the landscape, and have become embedded in local economies where they're supported by powerful unions, fueled by corporate interests, and perpetuated by the reality that some elected officials have become dependent on the economic and political benefits of having prisons in their districts. But I would hope that our critique of the American experiment with high rates of incarceration would begin instead with a consideration of the human cost, a recognition that we have wasted hundreds of thousands of lives, subjected thousands of our fellow citizens to the inhumane treatment of solitary confinement. We have separated families in a modern version of the slave auction block, and have consigned millions of Americans to a state of marginalized life, cut off from meaningful work, necessary benefits, and political participation and family support. Many years ago, as the system of apartheid was being installed in South Africa, Alan Paton, a white South African author, wrote a novel describing the racial realities in that society with a memorable and powerful title, Cry the Beloved Country. When we look at our current imprisonment realities, we should have the same response. What has happened to our beloved country? So turning around this quarter-century experiment will take enormous help from our superheroes. We need strong science to show the impact of imprisonment on the people held in prisons, their families, and the communities they have left behind. We need strong science to demonstrate the effectiveness of alternatives to incarceration, to in-prison programs, to reentry initiatives, and new approaches to community supervision. But this is a policy arena where we must recognize that even the strongest science will not be enough. So we're going to need to call upon our second superhero, passion, to play a primary role in promoting a system that is more humane. We need to remind people that prisons hold people, that millions of children are growing up without their parents, that corrections officers also live in prisons and work in prisons and must endure challenging circumstances, that victims are not helped if the person who harmed them is simply incarcerated and neither the victims nor the offender's needs are addressed. So, of all the 5 challenges I've offered this afternoon, this is the toughest. So how do we go about this? So I would suggest we start with a clean slate, asking the deepest philosophical and jurisprudential questions. Why should we send anybody to prison? Under what circumstances should the state be authorized to deprive somebody of their liberty? How long is long enough? Then if we had fewer prisons, how would the money be better invested? To help victims recover, provide alternatives to incarceration, to fund the tougher work of solving the problems that gave rise to crime? So this, our biggest challenge, will require the greatest feat of our imagination. It will require the very best of our 2 superheroes. It will require deep and sustained political work to persuade our elected officials that we need to reverse course and abandon our over-reliance on prison as a response to crime. So the work that lies ahead builds on some sobering lessons from the past 25 years. We punish too much and heal too little. Too often we isolate rather than integrate those who have caused harm. Too often we neglect rather than comfort those who have been harmed. Our over-reliance on the power of the state rather than the moral voice of family and community undermines the promise of our democracy. Yet, despite these sobering realizations, I believe we face the next quarter century with hope, a fervent hope that in the next chapter of our history we can be more effective and more humane as we respond to crime, that we can address the compelling problem of violence in our inner cities while reducing rates of incarceration and promoting racial reconciliation between the police, the justice system, and the policed, that we can return to rates of imprisonment that are consistent with our values as a nation. We have, in fact, every reason to be optimistic about our future. And when you think about it, the greatest reason for optimism is that so many Americans, like the people in this room, working around the country with organizations like the Sentencing Project, are so fiercely committed to justice. Keep up the good work.
I'd asked Jeremy to give us a vision for 2036. I didn't realize we'd get a bonus of getting the whole blueprint, but that was just a wonderful, both inspirational and very grounded in the realities of today, and I think gives us a wonderful way to think about moving forward from this day. And I so appreciate all the thought you've put into this, not only for today, but your whole career in thinking about these issues. We now have a challenge for all of you. We are trying to have the world's shortest coffee break ever now in order to do justice to the panel that's coming up. And so we have some refreshments outside. We are going to start at 3:25. If you're not in the room, you're going to miss the first few moments of a terrific panel. So do your business and get back here, and we look forward to continuing. Thank you.